The river runs dark in Cleveland, not just with water, but with the echoes of screams, gunfire, and footsteps that vanish into the night. On a bright summer morning in 1908, Cleveland's bustling downtown prepared for its 4th of July celebrations, a day meant for laughter, fireworks, and patriotic cheer. But inside one popular dime store, a single spark would ignite more than just holiday festivities. It would unleash a storm of fire, panic, and heroism, and leave a scar on the city that would burn in memory long after the embers cooled. If you stood on Ontario Street in Cleveland at the dawn of July 3, 1908, you'd find yourself in the heartbeat of a city riding high on industry and optimism. Streetcars clattered over rails, vendors called out their daily specials, and shoppers wove in and out of storefronts, their arms laden with goods. In the center of it all sat the S. Kresge store, a 2-floor temple of affordable wonders, where a dime could buy you anything from kitchenware to candy. The air inside was thick with the smell of fresh fabrics, polished wood counters, and, that week, something else. The tang of gunpowder and cardboard from a massive fireworks display. In an era before safety codes and fire inspections were much more than suggestions, the store had packed its shelves with Roman candles, firecrackers, sparklers, and skyrockets, all ready for eager holiday customers. For 2 young sisters, Anna and Frida Trefall, this was just another workday. Orphans who had come to Cleveland from Wisconsin, they'd found employment at Kresge's and a sense of independence in a bustling city. Anna, 24, worked downstairs. Frida, just 17, manned the 2nd floor. They were known for their closeness, often taking their breaks together, sharing jokes, and watching each other's counters when one needed a moment. Elsewhere in the store, the day was unfolding for a cast of characters whose names would soon be etched into one of the city's most tragic tales. Mary Hughes, a dressmaker's assistant, had stopped in to buy material. Ed Bolton, a shipping clerk from next door, had started his morning among crates and invoices, unaware he'd soon be sprinting into flames. A 4-year-old boy named Jimmy Parker, hand in hand with his mother Minnie, was simply there to see the magic of holiday sparklers up close. The store's janitor, Luther Roberts, moved quietly through the aisles, a man most customers barely noticed. But before the day was over, his name would be spoken in reverent tones across Cleveland. By 10:50 a.m., the aisles were alive with shoppers. Music drifted from a piano where a clerk played the popular tune, "I Don't Want to Go Home in the Dark." At the front display, teenage clerk Winifred Duncan stood holding a lit sparkler, part of a live demonstration ordered by the store manager. In those days, a lit sparkler inside a room full of fireworks was not viewed as reckless. It was salesmanship. The manager assured her it was perfectly harmless. But in an instant, that illusion shattered. A few stray sparks caught the fabric of a decorative American flag. The flag ignited, its flames leaping to Minnie Parker's dress. As she and others tried desperately to smother the flames, burning fragments fell onto the fireworks counters. The first explosion came like a cannon blast. In seconds, the entire stock of fireworks roared to life, firecrackers detonating in chains, rockets streaking wildly through the air, Roman candles spitting fireballs across the room. Smoke thickened into a choking cloud. Shoppers screamed, dropped their purchases, and surged toward the exits. The building's design became a death trap. The rear of the store had 2 aisles leading back, but only one led to an actual door. The other ended at barred windows, sealed with steel and wire to deter burglars. Those who turned the wrong way found themselves trapped in a steel-caged corner, the fire at their backs. Upstairs, clerks and customers scrambled to the front and rear windows. Some jumped into rescue nets hastily held by firemen below. Others missed the nets entirely, crashing to the pavement. The air was filled with the hiss of burning goods, the deafening crack of explosives, and the desperate cries of those still inside. And through it all, acts of raw courage emerged. Roberts, the janitor, smashed open second-floor windows and hauled women and children to the fire escape, returning again and again until smoke blinded him. Ed Bolton, from next door, charged into the inferno, dragging strangers to safety before breaking his arm in a botched umbrella-assisted rescue. And Anna Trefall, twice pulled towards safety, fought her way back inside to find her sister. The two were later discovered in each other's arms, among the victims at the barred windows. When the fire was finally out, 7 lay dead, dozens were injured, and Cleveland was left stunned. In the days to come, anger over the senselessness of the disaster would boil over, leading to one of the nation's earliest pushes for stricter fireworks laws. But for now, all that remained was smoke over Ontario Street, and the grief of a city that had just witnessed its saddest Fourth. The flames at the S. Kresge store had been extinguished, but the scene on Ontario Street was anything but calm. The air still hung heavy with the bitter scent of burnt powder and scorched wood. Smoke curled lazily from shattered windows. Onlookers crowded in, held back by a line of weary police officers and firefighters. At first, there was relief, the assumption that all survivors had been pulled out. But as the fire chief's men began their grim search through the ruins, that hope collapsed. Around 12:30 p.m., a group of firefighters pried open a scorched alcove at the back right corner of the store. What they found silenced the street. Huddled together by the barred windows lay the bodies of 6 women, their limbs intertwined, as though in their final moments they had clung to one another for breath. Beside them, miraculously still alive, was a little boy. He was carried out into the daylight and rushed to help, but his injuries were too severe. By the time his parents were told, 4-year-old Jimmy Parker had joined the others in death. The newspapers moved fast. Headlines screamed of heroism and horror. One, in bold type, read, "Stays to save sister and both die." Anna and Frida Trefall became the most talked about victims, their bond in life immortalized by the way they were found in death, arms wrapped tightly around each other's necks. Stories of courage poured in. Luther Roberts was hailed as the chief hero, credited with saving multiple lives before being forced back by smoke. Ed Bolton's daring, running headlong into the fire, returning to work with a broken arm, was celebrated with almost as much awe as disbelief. And then there was Mrs. Fanny Frank, who had leapt from a second-story ledge while shielding her granddaughter from the fall. But alongside the tributes came anger. How had a store been allowed to stock such a huge quantity of fireworks in its aisles? Why were windows barred with steel when customers were inside? And why had there never been a fire drill? Coroner Burke convened an inquest, summoning witnesses in rapid succession. Clerks described the chaotic layout. Survivors testified they didn't even know the barred windows existed. Store management defended the use of sparklers in demonstrations, insisting they were considered harmless. Legally, it seemed no one had broken any laws. The sale and storage of fireworks inside retail buildings was perfectly legal in Cleveland at the time. The coroner's final words summed up the frustration. It was morally wrong for that condition to be permitted to exist, but no one is legally culpable. The public wasn't satisfied with that. The tragedy hit at the start of a long holiday weekend, and by the following Monday, the outrage had crystallized into political action. On July 6, 1908, Councilman Daniel Fall introduced an ordinance banning the sale, possession, or public use of fireworks in the city. Critics accused him of overreach, but Fall stood firm, pointing to the smoldering ruins on Ontario Street as Exhibit A. Just 1 week later, the measure passed the Cleveland City Council, 21 votes to 11. Mayor Tom Johnson signed it into law. In less than 2 weeks, a disaster had triggered one of the earliest and strictest fireworks bans in the country. Newspapers around the nation took note, and other cities began drafting similar measures. What happened at Kresge's helped ignite a broader movement for what reformers began calling a safe and sane 4th of July. Still, for the families of the victims, legislation was small comfort. The funerals came quickly. Mourners lined the streets, the coffins draped in flowers, the stories of bravery told again and again in hushed voices. For many, the image of that barred alcove would linger in nightmares, the awful knowledge that a wrong turn inside a burning building could seal your fate. The building itself would be rebuilt, its facade changing over the decades until the day came when passers-by had no idea of the tragedy it once contained. But the events of July 3, 1908, remained part of Cleveland's collective memory. A day when the city learned, in the hardest possible way, that progress often comes written in ash and grief. On a warm August night in 1910, one of Cleveland's most powerful men stepped out of his exclusive golf club, just a short walk from his mansion. He never made it home. By morning, the city's elite were whispering in private rooms. The newspapers were screaming in bold type, and the man's body was lying cold in a morgue, a small knife still in his hand. August 1910. Cleveland was booming. The smokestacks that lined its lakefront roared day and night, and its avenues bustled with streetcars, carriages, and the occasional motorcar. For the wealthy, life was exceptionally good. Inflation was a distant worry. There was no federal income tax. The city's upper crust gathered in plush clubs, wore tailored suits from Superior Avenue shops, and built sprawling estates high above the city in the newly developed suburb of Cleveland Heights. Among these power brokers was William Low Rice, attorney, real estate developer, businessman. At 47, Rice was not just wealthy, he was connected. He had helped shape entire neighborhoods, including the upscale Euclid Heights allotment where he lived. His mansion, Low Ridge, stood on the crest of Overlook Road, a massive colonial-style home with manicured gardens and a view that stretched down over the city's Little Italy. Rice was a man accustomed to control. Sharp, ambitious, and sometimes hard-edged in business, he had built his fortune in part by rescuing, and sometimes taking over, financially troubled properties. Friends described him as confident and charming. Employees sometimes saw a different side, one unwilling to give an inch. That Friday, August 5th, began without drama. His wife Elise and their 4 daughters were away at a summer retreat in Massachusetts, and Rice spent the morning at his downtown office in the Schofield building. In the late afternoon, he headed to the Euclid Golf Club, the social hub for Cleveland Heights elite, where he played a few rounds with the club pro. He stayed for dinner in good spirits, joking with other members. By 10:30 p.m., the night air was still warm as Rice left the club, choosing to walk home rather than be driven. It was a short stroll, just a few hundred yards along Euclid Heights Boulevard, past well-tended lawns and the occasional cluster of trees. Gas lamps lit the street at intervals, their glow pooling on the pavement. Somewhere near the corner of Derbyshire Road and Euclid Heights Boulevard, less than 500 feet from his back gate, Rice stepped into darkness and into danger. Residents nearby later told police they heard it. Sharp cracks in the night, like gunfire. Some counted 2 shots, others swore there were more. A few heard footsteps pounding away, disappearing into the quiet streets. When Rice was found minutes later, he was lying in the road, bleeding heavily from his face and head. He had been shot twice, one bullet grazing him, the other shattering bone and lodging deep in his skull. His left hand bore a deep defensive slash, the kind a man gets when grabbing at a blade. His coat sleeves were sliced, suggesting someone had gone at him with a knife before pulling the trigger. And beside him, his fingers stained with his own blood, lay a small open penknife, the weapon of a man who had fought to the last. 2 local doctors driving by stopped and tried to save him. Patrolman C. L. Wall, one of the first officers on the scene, quickly realized the injuries were fatal. By the time Rice reached St. Luke's Hospital, he was gone. The news hit Cleveland like a lightning bolt. This was no random citizen. This was a man at the pinnacle of the city's social and economic ladder, murdered practically at his own doorstep. In the days that followed, speculation ran wild. Had Rice been the victim of robbers? If so, why was nothing taken? Not the gold rings, the diamond collar pin, the wad of cash in his pocket? Was it a business enemy settling a score? Personal vendetta? Or something more scandalous? The shadow of an affair? A grudge harbored in the tight-knit world of Cleveland's elite? And then came the most tantalizing detail. The name of a neighbor, one with a complicated history with Rice, quietly began circulating among investigators. The morning after William Low Rice's killing, the newspapers didn't hold back. Prominent lawyer slain on Heights, screamed the headlines. Beneath them were columns of speculation. Some whispered in drawing rooms the night before, others shouted over coffee in downtown cafes. The official story at first was simple: robbers had struck. Patrolman Wall, the first on the scene, believed it. So did some of Rice's family. The image was straightforward. A wealthy man, alone at night, ambushed by footpads. As street thieves were called then. He resisted, they attacked, and they left him bleeding in the road. But as investigators walked the crime scene in daylight, that theory began to unravel. If it was a robbery, why hadn't the killers taken anything? Rice's diamond cuff links still gleamed in his shirt cuffs. His gold rings were untouched. In his pockets, a gold bankbook, a wad of cash totaling over $130, and a stick pin inlaid with opal, all still there. Then there was the location. The attack happened practically under an arc streetlight, directly across from a streetcar route where cars passed every 12 minutes. That was not where seasoned criminals made their move. And Rice, who was no stranger to Cleveland's rougher edges, was a trained boxer. Whoever killed him had come prepared for a fight and for silence. Witnesses trickled in. Several recalled hearing 2, perhaps 3 shots. Some heard hurried footsteps running away. A few claimed to see shadowy figures slipping through the darkness. One man with a mustache and a straw hat, another who might have been a woman in a shawl. There was even talk of foreign-looking strangers loitering earlier that evening. And then came the most intriguing detail yet. A bag of dead chickens found near the scene. To some, this was proof of a simpler explanation. Chicken thieves, surprised by Rice, had killed him to avoid arrest. It was the kind of theory that could explain the knife wounds, but not the precision of the gunshots or the boldness of striking so close to his home. While the Cleveland Heights police chased leads among Italian laborers, black workmen, and other marginalized groups, more out of prejudice than evidence, Cuyahoga County prosecutors quietly zeroed in on a different kind of suspect. One who lived just a stone's throw from Low Ridge. His name was John Hartness Brown. Brown wasn't just a neighbor, he was a former business associate. The two men had been partners in the Euclid Heights Realty Company, the very development where they both lived. But by 1910, the relationship had soured. Financial troubles had put Brown in a position where Rice allegedly maneuvered control of one of Brown's most prized assets, the John Hartness Brown building downtown. Neighbors whispered that Brown had been humiliated. Investigators learned that, in the months before the murder, Rice had been receiving threats. He'd even taken to sleeping with 2 loaded revolvers beneath his mattress. At the inquest, prosecutors John Klein and Charles Olds didn't hide their focus. They grilled witnesses about Brown's whereabouts that night. Brown claimed he'd been visiting friends near East 102nd Street and only arrived back on the Heights around 11:20 p.m. The problem? No streetcar conductors on the Euclid Heights line remembered seeing him. 2, however, remembered him vividly on a different line, the East 105th, at a time that could have put him much closer to the murder scene. It was circumstantial, but it painted a picture. And then came the detail that set tongues wagging. Within an hour of Rice's body arriving at the morgue, Brown had called, asking if Mr. Rice's body was there. According to the attendant, no one had told Brown the victim's identity. Brown's response? That he'd simply assumed, having heard commotion near Rice's home. It wasn't enough to charge him, but for many, it was enough to make him the prime suspect. Still, without physical evidence, no weapon, no witness placing him at the scene, the case against Brown stalled. The official record closed with an unsatisfying truth. William Lowe Rice's murder remained unsolved. Yet, in Cleveland's upper circles, the suspicion never really faded. Brown would live out his life under the quiet cloud of what many believed, but no one could prove. Deep beneath Lake Erie, a crew of men worked in darkness, digging, sweating, fighting the press of water and the weight of earth above. Then, in the pre-dawn hours of July 24, 1916, something happened. A blast, poison in the air, and in the pitch-black tunnel, men began crawling for their lives, some never making it out. In the summer of 1916, Cleveland was a city on the rise. Industry churned at full steam, and the population, swelled by immigrants from across Europe, demanded more of everything. Housing, jobs, and, critically, clean water. The answer lay in massive engineering projects stretching under Lake Erie. Intake tunnels designed to draw fresh water from far offshore, away from the polluted shallows near the city. The work was dangerous. Crews labored hundreds of feet from shore, through narrow shafts drilled down into the lakebed, then out into horizontal tunnels under immense pressure. The air was damp, stale, and laced with hazards, from falling rock to sudden cave-ins. But the pay was better than most factory jobs, and for many it was a ticket to steady work. On the night of July 23rd, a crew descended into one such tunnel, the new number 5 intake, nearly 4 miles offshore. Among them were a mix of seasoned diggers and new hires. They worked by the light of lanterns, tools clanging against stone, their voices echoing down the narrow bore. At the far end, progress was measured in feet per week. Just after midnight, disaster struck. The first sign was a muffled thump. Not the deafening roar of an explosion, but something deeper, stranger. Men looked up from their work, confused. Then came the smell. A sharp, acrid sting that seared the throat and lungs. In moments, the air turned deadly. What had happened was this. A pocket of natural gas or fumes from blasting powder had ignited, releasing a wave of toxic smoke and gas through the tunnel. The confined space turned it into a death trap. Men dropped their tools and scrambled toward the shaft hundreds of feet back. Those nearest the blast were overcome instantly. Others, their eyes burning, lungs screaming, dropped to their knees, crawling to escape the heavier gases that pooled along the tunnel ceiling. Word raced up the shaft to the surface. Rescue teams were scrambled. Not just firefighters, but fellow waterworks men, many of them friends of those trapped below. Without protective gear, they went down into the same poisoned air. One team, led by a foreman named Gus Van Duzen, already a veteran of previous tunnel disasters, managed to reach the stricken crew. They tied ropes around limp bodies and hauled them back to the shaft. But the gas didn't care about heroism. One by one, rescuers staggered, collapsed, and joined the list of victims. In the end, more than a dozen men, workers, and would-be saviors alike were dead. By dawn, the scene on the surface was grim. The tunnel opening was ringed by onlookers, wives and children clutching each other, hoping for a miracle. Each time a body was hoisted up, cries rose and fell. The newspapers, quick to sensationalize, would seize on the most haunting image: the survivors' stories of men dragging themselves along the tunnel floor in the final minutes of life, and the headline that stuck: "They died crawling." The city mourned, but also questioned. Why had safety equipment been non-existent? Why had rescuers been allowed to enter without breathing apparatus? Officials promised reforms, but the work went on. Cleveland still needed its water. For the families of the dead, there were no easy answers, just the memory of that long, awful night when the lake itself seemed to turn against the men who labored beneath it. In the summer of 1919, a wealthy man lay dying in his Lakewood mansion, stabbed 11 times, poisoned, and gasping for breath. At his bedside, his wife wept. But behind the tears was a secret, and when it came out, Cleveland would give her a nickname whispered with equal parts fascination and fear: Lady Borgia. Lakewood, Ohio, in 1919 was the picture of suburban respectability. Broad tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and stately homes spoke of security and success. And among the residents enjoying that comfort was Daniel Caber, a prosperous real estate man, living in a grand home on Edgewater Drive with his wife, Eva, and their daughter. To the outside world, the Cabers looked like an enviable couple. Daniel was successful, respected, and well-liked. Eva was fashionable, sociable, and active in the community. But behind the closed doors of their mansion, the marriage was strained. Daniel was known to be controlling with money and stubborn in business dealings. Eva chafed under what she saw as his stinginess and coldness. By 1918, tensions had reached a boiling point. Eva confided to friends that she felt trapped. Divorce in that era carried stigma, especially for a woman of her social standing. But as the world would later learn, Eva found another path. It began with whispers, casual conversations that took a darker turn. Eva, it seemed, had begun quietly asking acquaintances if they knew anyone who could take care of her husband. She wasn't looking for a lawyer. She was looking for a killer. Her plan was elaborate. First, she tried to arrange for Daniel to be poisoned, arsenic slipped into his food and drink over time. But when the poison worked too slowly for her liking, she shifted to a more direct method. On the night of July 19, 1919, Daniel was home, reportedly in bed and unwell. That's when Eva's hired men struck. They stabbed him 11 times, including in a place so cruel and deliberate it shocked even seasoned investigators. The groin. Later, an autopsy would reveal traces of arsenic in his body, evidence that Eva's earlier plan had already been in motion. Eva played the grieving widow convincingly at first. Neighbors saw her draped in black, her face pale and drawn. But police, probing deeper, began to hear the same story from multiple sources. Eva had been talking about wanting her husband dead for months. The whispers turned into testimony. Eventually, the hired killers were caught, and under questioning, they talked. They described Eva's role, her promises of payment, her instructions, even her cold critiques of how the job had been done. In 1921, Eva went on trial. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, curiosity seekers, and society women craning for a glimpse of the widow accused of orchestrating one of the most sensational murders in Cleveland history. The press dubbed her Lakewood's Lady Borgia, invoking the infamous Italian Renaissance family known for poison and political intrigue. The prosecution painted her as calculating and ruthless. The defense tried to cast her as a desperate woman pushed to the brink by an oppressive husband. In the end, the jury didn't buy it. Eva was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. She would serve more than a decade before being paroled, living quietly until her death. But the case left an indelible mark, a reminder that beneath the polished surface of suburban respectability, the darkest impulses can hide in plain sight. It started as a low hiss, the sound of escaping gas in Cleveland's industrial heart. Minutes later, the East Ohio Gas Company's massive storage tanks erupted with the force of a bomb. In seconds, an entire neighborhood was transformed into an inferno. For those trapped inside it, the streets themselves had become hell. On the afternoon of October 20th, 1944, the air over Cleveland's east side carried a strange scent. Faint at first, then unmistakable gas. The East Ohio Gas Company maintained a sprawling storage facility in the area, home to enormous spherical tanks holding millions of cubic feet of liquefied natural gas, LNG. The facility stood in a densely populated working-class neighborhood, its chain-link fences almost touching the backyards of family homes. Just after 2:30 p.m., workers noticed something wrong. One of the tanks was leaking. LNG, stored at extremely low temperatures, had begun to spill into the containment area, vaporizing into a cloud of heavier-than-air gas. It drifted invisibly along the ground, seeping under doors and into basements. At 2:41 p.m., the inevitable happened. The gas found an ignition source, perhaps a pilot light, perhaps a spark from a furnace. The explosion tore through the first tank, sending a fireball hundreds of feet into the air. In an instant, the blast wave shattered windows blocks away. People on the street were thrown to the ground. Inside nearby homes, families were hurled against walls. But the real nightmare was only beginning. The explosion ignited the massive cloud of gas that had crept unseen through the neighborhood. Flames roared through basements, raced under sidewalks, and erupted through manholes in jets of fire. Entire houses went up like matchsticks. The East Ohio gas facility itself became a scene from a war zone. Workers scrambled to shut down valves, but the heat from the blaze was so intense it warped steel and melted streetcar rails. One by one, the other storage tanks began to fail, each detonation sending another towering fireball skyward. The noise was deafening, a series of concussions that echoed across the city. Firefighters from every corner of Cleveland responded, but the scale of the disaster was overwhelming. Water hoses froze into uselessness in the superheated air. In some streets, crews could not advance because the asphalt itself was burning. Survivors described running through alleys, shielding their faces from waves of heat, the soles of their shoes sticking to molten pavement. For many, there was no escape. The death toll would ultimately reach 130, making it one of the deadliest industrial accidents in U.S. history. In the aftermath, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. block after block reduced to blackened foundations and twisted metal. The disaster spurred immediate changes in how liquefied natural gas was stored and handled nationwide. Tanks were moved away from populated areas, and safety protocols were overhauled. But for Cleveland, the scars were more than physical. The East Ohio gas explosion was a reminder that even in peacetime, the machinery of modern life could unleash destruction on a scale that rivaled the war raging overseas. He was a conman, a drifter, a thief, and, depending on who you asked, a lunatic or a genius. In 1923, John Leonard Whitfield rolled into Cleveland with a story so strange and a trail of crimes so brazen that newspapers couldn't decide whether he was sent by God, the devil, or neither. It was early spring when John Leonard Whitfield first made his mark on Cleveland. He was a big man, physically imposing, with a swagger that suggested he was used to talking his way into and out of trouble. He claimed to be an inventor, a businessman, and sometimes even a man of God. But his real specialty was separating people from their money. Whitfield was a master of deception. He could talk like an educated man, drop the names of influential people, and spin tales so grand they made skepticism seem small-minded. He moved from city to city, often leaving just ahead of the law, his pockets heavier than when he'd arrived. In Cleveland, he began by ingratiating himself with church leaders and business owners. He spoke at length about charitable ventures, technological innovations, and investment opportunities. Each pitch had the same structure: a noble purpose, a hint of urgency, and a promise of great returns. All he needed was financial backing. Soon, though, his dealings turned darker. Police records later showed a string of thefts, bad checks, and swindles in his wake. He'd rent fine clothes from local outfitters, never to return them. He'd stay in hotels under false names, leaving unpaid bills. He passed forged documents with such confidence that even experienced clerks signed off without question. But it wasn't just his crimes that fascinated the press. It was his behavior when cornered. In one infamous incident, Whitfield reportedly leapt onto a church pulpit mid-service, declaring he was anointed by God to cleanse the city of corruption. On another occasion, he told arresting officers he was possessed by the devil himself and could not be held responsible for his actions. Whether it was an act or a genuine mental break, the courtroom became his stage. During his trial, he oscillated between tearful repentance and wild accusations against the judge, the police, and even his own lawyer. Reporters ate it up, dubbing him God, the devil, man, or beast. A headline that captured the city's confusion about what they were witnessing. In the end, the jury was unmoved by his theatrics. Whitfield was convicted and given a lengthy prison sentence. But even behind bars, his legend lingered. To some, he was a cautionary tale, proof that charm without conscience is just another form of danger. To others, he was a reminder that the line between brilliance and madness can be razor-thin. And sometimes, it's hard to tell which side a man is on. It was the middle of the night in February 1932. Most of the Ellington Apartments residents were asleep when a faint smell of smoke crept through the hallways. Within 5 minutes, that smell became a roaring inferno. For many, there was no way out. The Ellington Apartments sat at 1030 Euclid Avenue, a fashionable address for Clevelanders who wanted a prime location near the city's theaters, offices, and shops. It was the kind of place where a mix of working professionals, elderly residents, and young couples shared the same polished hallways. But in the early hours of February 5, 1932, those hallways turned into death traps. At around 2:20 a.m., smoke began to drift from the basement laundry room. The cause would later be traced to faulty wiring, a slow electrical smolder that suddenly flared into open flame. The building's old wooden framing and drafty air shafts became perfect conduits for fire. Within minutes, the flames had shot up several floors, feeding on curtains, rugs, and furniture. The Ellington had no sprinkler system, not unusual for the time, and its fire alarms were rudimentary. Many residents woke only when smoke seeped under their doors or when shouts echoed up the stairwells. By then, visibility in the halls was already near zero. The panic was immediate. Some tried to reach the stairwells but were driven back by heat and smoke. Others went to the windows, desperate for air, waving frantically at the street below. Firefighters arrived quickly, but their ladders could not reach the top floors. They stretched nets on the sidewalks and shouted for people to jump. Some made it. Others hesitated too long. Witnesses would later recall the heartbreaking moments when figures leaned out of windows, engulfed in smoke, and then vanished from sight. Inside, the firefighters battled not just the flames but the clock. The building's layout, narrow halls, multiple turns, made navigation treacherous. They crawled along the floors, feeling for unconscious bodies. Several residents were found collapsed just feet from their doors, overcome by smoke before they could escape. In the end, the fire claimed 18 lives and injured dozens more. The victims came from all walks of life: a retired seamstress, a young newlywed, a salesman who had moved in only a week before. The Ellington fire became a turning point in Cleveland's fire safety regulations. Officials began pushing for stricter building codes, better alarm systems, and fire escapes that actually met safety standards. But for the survivors, those reforms came too late. They would forever remember that night as a 5-minute window between the comfort of sleep and the terror of running for their lives. On a crisp October morning in 1870, the breakfast table at a modest Cleveland boarding house became the stage for one of the city's most shocking murders. By the time the coffee cooled, a man was dead, and the story behind it was tangled in jealousy, betrayal, and revenge. In the years after the Civil War, Cleveland was a city on the rise, but still small enough that scandal could ripple through every neighborhood in a matter of hours. Boarding houses dotted the city, shared spaces where travelers, laborers, and the upwardly mobile rented rooms, often sharing meals with strangers who quickly became part of the daily rhythm. One such house was run by Mrs. Amelia Galantine, a respectable widow with a reputation for keeping her establishment tidy and her guests in line. Among her boarders was Captain Thomas Jones, a former Great Lakes sailor who now worked in the shipping business. Jones was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, confident, and known to be fond of both drink and the attention of women. Another resident was Miss Mary Richards, a young schoolteacher with a quiet demeanor and a complicated connection to Jones. Though their relationship wasn't formally acknowledged, whispers suggested they had been more than friends. Trouble began when a new boarder arrived, Edward Parker, a traveling salesman with sharp features, an easy smile, and, apparently, an immediate interest in Miss Richards. What began as polite conversation soon turned into late-night talks in the parlor, walks to church, and lingering glances across the dinner table. Captain Jones noticed, and he didn't take it well. In the days leading up to the incident, witnesses recalled hearing Jones and Parker exchanging tense words. Jones accused Parker of disrespect. Parker reportedly laughed it off. But underneath, tempers were building. On the morning of October 12, 1870, the boarders gathered for breakfast. Mrs. Galantine poured coffee while the others settled into their seats. Parker was already at the table, chatting lightly. Jones entered late, his face tight, his eyes fixed on Parker. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Jones approached the table, reached into his coat, and drew a revolver. Without a word, he fired, the shot striking Parker in the chest. The room erupted in chaos. Miss Richards screamed. Mrs. Galantine froze, coffee pot in hand. Parker slumped forward, gasping, before collapsing to the floor. Jones didn't run. He placed the revolver on the table and said evenly, "That will be enough of that." When police arrived, he surrendered without protest. The trial that followed drew packed galleries. Jones claimed self-defense, insisting Parker had threatened him and made gestures suggesting he was armed. But witnesses disputed that, saying Parker had been seated, unarmed, and unaware of what was coming. The jury didn't buy Jones's version. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The press dubbed the case Cold Lead for Breakfast, a headline that stuck, part condemnation, part grim joke. For Cleveland, it was a reminder that even in the polite setting of a boarding house dining room, human passions could erupt with deadly force. And for those who had been there that morning, the clink of a coffee cup would forever carry the memory of gunfire. On a cold November night in 1895, streetcars rattled across Cleveland's Central Viaduct, their passengers bundled against the wind. Then, without warning, a section of the bridge gave way. In an instant, riders, horses, and wagons plunged into the icy darkness below. The Central Viaduct was one of Cleveland's proudest engineering achievements when it opened in 1888. A sweeping, elevated roadway more than 3,200 feet long, spanning the Cuyahoga River and linking the city's east and west sides. Built of steel and stone, it was a marvel for its time, carrying streetcars, carriages, and pedestrians high above the river's industrial valley. But by 1895, the viaduct was already showing its age. The constant vibration of traffic, exposure to the elements, and the weight of electric streetcars had put stress on its structure. Engineers knew repairs were needed, but the work was done in sections, often leaving parts of the bridge partially dismantled. On the night of November 16, 1895, a crew was repairing the western approach. A temporary wooden trestle had been erected where a section of the steel roadway had been removed. That evening, a streetcar of the Broadway line approached the work zone, its interior lit by gas lamps, passengers chatting quietly as it rattled along the rails. The conductor slowed as he neared the temporary section, but not enough. Witnesses later claimed the car seemed to jolt forward abruptly, as if it had jumped the track. There was a splintering crack, a roar of snapping timbers, and then the streetcar, along with the wooden trestle beneath it, dropped into the darkness. It was a fall of more than 100 feet into the black, frigid water of the Cuyahoga. Inside the car, passengers were thrown against each other, lanterns shattered, and in the confusion, gas ignited. Flames spread even as the wreckage hit the river, hissing in clouds of steam. Rescue efforts began immediately. Workers from the bridge, boatmen from the riverbanks, and police from both sides of the city rushed to the scene. But the combination of fire, icy water, and tangled debris made survival almost impossible. Many of those who hadn't been killed by the fall were trapped in the submerged streetcar. By the next morning, the recovery teams were bringing up bodies. Some burned, others frozen stiff. In total, 17 people were dead, with more injured. The newspapers called it the horror of all horrors, a headline that captured both the shock and the spectacle of the disaster. Public outrage followed. Questions were raised about why a temporary wooden section had been used at all, and whether the streetcar crew had ignored safety warnings. The city responded with stricter oversight of bridge maintenance and streetcar operations. But for many Clevelanders, the Central Viaduct disaster became an enduring symbol of the dangers hidden within the city's rapid growth. The bridge itself would stand for decades longer, but its reputation was forever shadowed by that cold November night when the pride of Cleveland engineering failed in the most public and deadly way imaginable. When 37-year-old Hazel Gogan was found dead in her Cleveland apartment in 1950, police expected a straightforward case. Maybe a heart attack, maybe an accident. What they got instead was a toxicology report that read like a riddle, and a trail of clues that led nowhere. On the morning of April 18, 1950, Hazel Gogan's landlady noticed her tenant's mailbox was overflowing and the door to her second-floor apartment stood ajar. Inside, the rooms were quiet. Hazel lay sprawled on her bed, still in her nightclothes, as if she had simply drifted off to sleep and never woken up. Hazel wasn't a recluse, but she lived alone. Neighbors described her as polite but private, a woman who kept to herself and worked odd jobs to make ends meet. She had no known health problems and, at least to casual acquaintances, no enemies. The first theory was natural causes. But when the coroner's office began the standard examination, they found something odd. Hazel's lips were faintly discolored, and there was a strange chemical smell in the room. Further testing revealed the presence of a powerful poison in her system. Not in a lethal dose all at once, but in smaller amounts over time. It was thallium sulfate, a toxic compound commonly used in rat poison. Colorless, tasteless, and slow-acting, it could be slipped into food or drink without notice. Its effects, hair loss, nerve damage, organ failure, could take weeks to manifest fully. Detectives quickly began asking questions. Had Hazel been trying to take her own life? Had someone close to her been slowly poisoning her? Or was she an accidental victim, perhaps exposed through contaminated food or water? There were no clear answers. Her kitchen showed no signs of rodenticide, and no open containers were found that might have carried the poison. Friends said she'd been in good spirits in the days before her death. There was no note, no sign of despair. Investigators dug into her personal life. They learned she'd once been engaged, but the relationship had ended years earlier. She had few close relatives and none nearby. The handful of co-workers they interviewed described her as reliable but unremarkable. No jealous lovers, no bitter enemies, no suspicious new acquaintances. The police tried to trace any recent purchases of thallium, a compound regulated even then, but came up empty. Without evidence of who had access to her food or drink, the case stalled. The newspapers called it the poisoning without a motive. For weeks, Cleveland speculated. Was it a crime of opportunity, a botched attempt to kill someone else, or an act Hazel had kept secret until the end? In the end, the file was closed without charges. Hazel Gogan's death remains one of Cleveland's strangest unsolved cases. A mystery measured not in sudden violence, but in a slow, invisible killer that worked quietly until the day it stopped her heart. In 1920, Judge William H. McGannon was at the height of his career, respected in the courts, admired in political circles, and seen as a rising star in Cleveland's legal world. By 1921, he was disgraced, stripped of his robe, and at the center of a scandal that reached all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court. The name William H. McGannon once carried weight in Cleveland's law community. A former prosecutor turned judge, he was known for his sharp mind, commanding presence, and a knack for managing the personalities of both juries and attorneys. He was also ambitious, cultivating political allies and keeping his name in circulation for higher office. But in the volatile world of post-World War I politics, alliances could sour quickly, and enemies could be made in a heartbeat. In the fall of 1920, McGannon presided over a high-profile murder trial in Hamilton County, involving the killing of a well-known businessman. The press called it the Hamilton case, and it drew statewide attention. 2 men were accused, but prosecutors hinted at a third man, a shadowy figure who had allegedly orchestrated the crime but had so far avoided arrest. Somehow, McGannon's name became linked to this mystery figure, not as a suspect in the murder itself, but as someone accused of manipulating legal outcomes to protect certain interests. Whispers in courthouse hallways suggested that he had met privately with people connected to the defense, and that favors, political or otherwise, had been exchanged. The rumors might have faded, but the Ohio Attorney General's office decided to investigate. What began as a quiet inquiry soon became public spectacle. Reporters dug into McGannon's past cases, looking for patterns. Opponents seized the chance to paint him as corrupt, calling for his removal from the bench. McGannon fought back hard. He denied wrongdoing, accused his accusers of political assassination, and hired one of the city's most aggressive legal teams. For months, the fight played out in courtrooms and newspaper headlines, each side hurling accusations of lies, bias, and conspiracy. But the tide was against him. In early 1921, the Ohio Supreme Court issued its ruling. McGannon was to be removed from office. The decision cited misconduct, though the specifics were carefully couched in legal language that left some details vague. The fall from grace was swift. Overnight, the man who had once presided over major trials found himself practicing law quietly, far from the limelight. Friends drifted away. Political allies went silent. In Cleveland's legal community, the third man at Hamilton affair became a cautionary tale, a reminder that a judge's greatest asset is not his authority, but the perception of integrity. And once that's gone, no robe, gavel, or years of service can bring it back. On May 1, 1919, thousands marched through downtown Cleveland, waving red flags and calling for workers' rights. By nightfall, the streets were littered with broken glass, bloodstains, and abandoned banners, the aftermath of one of the most violent political clashes in the city's history. The spring of 1919 was tense across America. World War I had ended just months before, but the country was far from at peace. Soldiers were coming home to find jobs scarce and wages stagnant. Labor strikes were erupting nationwide, And the Russian Revolution 2 years earlier had sparked fears of Bolshevism spreading to American soil, what would soon be called the First Red Scare. Cleveland, with its large immigrant workforce and strong socialist movement, was a powder keg. When local labor leaders announced a May Day parade to demand better working conditions, the release of political prisoners, and recognition of Soviet Russia, the city's political and business leaders braced for trouble. The parade began peacefully enough. Thousands gathered on Superior Avenue, many carrying American flags, others holding the red banner of socialism. The crowd included trade unionists, war veterans, women's groups, and curious onlookers. Among them were returning soldiers who, while sympathetic to labor causes, bristled at the sight of the red flag, which to many symbolized not solidarity, but revolution and treason. The first clash came near Public Square. A group of uniformed veterans confronted marchers carrying a large red flag, demanding it be taken down. Shouts turned to shoves. Shoves turned to punches. Within minutes, police waded in swinging clubs. The crowd panicked, scattering in all directions. As the march splintered, the violence spread. Skirmishes broke out along Euclid Avenue and into side streets. Protesters were beaten and dragged to paddy wagons. Police officers were struck with thrown bricks and bottles. Mounted patrols charged into the crowds, their horses trampling banners and scattering demonstrators. By late afternoon, the city was in chaos. In some neighborhoods, angry mobs stormed Socialist Party offices, smashing windows and tearing down signs. Immigrant communities, particularly Russians, Finns, and Hungarians, found themselves targeted for reprisals, whether they had marched or not. By nightfall, the official toll stood at 2 dead, more than 40 seriously injured, and over 100 arrested. Most of those taken into custody were charged with disorderly conduct or displaying a red flag. In the weeks that followed, city leaders used the riot as justification for new crackdowns on radical political groups. For Cleveland's socialist movement, May Day 1919 was both a rallying cry and a devastating blow. For the rest of the city, it became a symbol of how quickly political tensions could ignite into open street warfare. And for decades after, the memory of that Red Dawn lingered, a reminder that in Cleveland, as in the rest of America, the battle over ideas could turn violent in the blink of an eye. He wasn't the biggest, the smartest, or the richest criminal in Cleveland, but if you asked the police in the 1910s who they feared might start the next street war, they had one answer: Jiggs Losteiner. And Jiggs was just fine with that. The name Charles Jiggs Losteiner was spoken with a mix of fear and grudging respect in Cleveland's rougher neighborhoods. Born to working-class immigrant parents, Jiggs grew up in the alleys and pool halls of the city's west side. By his teens, he was already running errands for local gamblers, occasionally breaking heads when someone needed a lesson. Jiggs wasn't a mastermind, but he was quick with his fists, fearless in a fight, and had a knack for rallying a crew around him. His specialty was the snatch and dash, jewelry stores, payroll deliveries, and liquor warehouses after hours. He wasn't afraid of daylight robberies, either, if the score was big enough. By the 1910s, Cleveland's police department knew Jiggs well. Arrest after arrest filled his rap sheet. Armed robbery, assault, extortion. Yet he seemed to slip through the cracks, often because witnesses were too scared to testify. Baddest Man in town wasn't just a nickname, it was a warning. His reputation for violence peaked after a botched payroll robbery on the city's east side. Jiggs and 2 associates hit a company courier in broad daylight, making off with thousands in cash. But the guard they'd assaulted didn't go quietly. He drew his pistol and fired. One of Jiggs' men went down, and Jiggs himself took a bullet in the arm before escaping in a stolen car. The police launched a manhunt, raiding known hideouts, questioning family members, and shaking down anyone who might know his whereabouts. Jiggs evaded capture for weeks, finally being cornered in a flophouse near the flats. When officers burst in, he reportedly grinned and said, "Took you long enough. Prison didn't reform him. If anything, it hardened him." Upon release, he went right back to strong-arm jobs, adding bootlegging to his repertoire during Prohibition. His saloons doubled as gambling dens, and his connections with other underworld figures made him a player in the city's organized crime scene. But Jiggs' swagger couldn't last forever. In the early 1920s, during yet another robbery attempt, things went wrong. A police officer was killed in the crossfire. This time, the public outrage was loud enough to ensure no leniency. Jiggs was sentenced to life, his days of swaggering through Cleveland's underworld over. In prison, he faded into relative obscurity, a man whose legend had burned bright in the city's criminal circles, but was ultimately snuffed out by the same violence that had made his name. For Cleveland's police, the end of Jiggs Losteiner's reign was more than just the removal of a dangerous criminal. It was proof that even the baddest man in town could be brought down when the city decided it had had enough. In the summer of 1945, Cleveland's underworld erupted in a wave of car bombings so brutal that the city earned a grim nickname, the car bomb capital of America. And at the center of it all was a mob boss whose enemies preferred dynamite to bullets. By the mid-1940s, Cleveland's criminal underworld was a tangled web of gambling rackets, bootlegging holdovers, and labor union muscle. At its heart was Alfred Big Al Polizzi, the city's undisputed mafia boss, until he stepped down in 1944 and retired to Florida. His departure created a power vacuum, and into that space stepped his hand-picked successor, John Scalish, a young, cautious leader determined to modernize the mob's operations. But not everyone was happy with Scalish's appointment. Among the discontented was Dominic Mick Milano, an ambitious mobster with a taste for flash and a willingness to take risks. Tensions simmered quietly at first, each side building alliances and counting the money flowing from gambling dens, bookmaking operations, and the docks. Then came the bombs. On July 5, 1945, a Buick parked outside Milano's favorite cafe exploded, killing 2 of his men and injuring several bystanders. The device, a package of dynamite wired to the ignition, was crude but effective. Police immediately suspected it was part of a mob turf war, but in Cleveland at the time, proving who planted a bomb was nearly impossible. Over the next few months, the violence escalated. Scalish's lieutenants were targeted in a series of car bombings that turned neighborhoods into crime scenes. In one notorious blast, a well-known enforcer was literally blown out of the driver's seat. His car flipped upside down in the middle of a busy intersection. The sheer public nature of the attacks terrified civilians. You didn't have to be a mobster to get caught in the blast radius. One of the most infamous victims was Louis the Tailor Rosanova, a longtime bookmaker with ties to both factions. On August 22, 1945, Rosanova started his Packard and never finished the turn of the key. The explosion killed him instantly, scattering shrapnel across half a block. The newspapers began calling Cleveland the car bomb city, and the label stuck. Editorials demanded action, but the police were caught between a code of silence in the underworld and the technical challenges of tracing explosives. By late 1946, the bombing spree began to subside, not because of arrests, but because of a backroom truce brokered between Scalish and Milano. The peace held, mostly, for the next 2 decades, as Scalish consolidated his hold on the Cleveland mob. But the scars remained. In the years that followed, Cleveland's gangland reputation was such that other cities' mob bosses used car bomb as shorthand for settling disputes the hard way. And for the ordinary people who had lived through the blasts, the memory of sudden, earth-shaking violence was never far away. It was the kind of discovery that turns a quiet spring morning into a city-wide sensation. In 1905, a battered steamer trunk sat unclaimed at Cleveland's Union Depot. When workers finally pried it open, what they found inside was no forgotten luggage. It was murder. On May 24, 1905, baggage handlers at Cleveland's Union Depot grew suspicious of a large, scuffed trunk that had been sitting in the storage area for days. It had arrived on a train from Buffalo, tagged for further shipment, but no one had come to claim it. The freight clerk noted a faint odor, sharp, metallic, and unmistakably foul. When police were called and the trunk pried open, they recoiled. Inside, folded unnaturally into the cramped space, was the body of a man. His head was bound in burlap, his limbs tied with cord. The smell made it clear he'd been dead for some time. The victim was later identified as Charles Murray, a petty criminal with a record of burglaries and cons stretching back years. He'd recently been seen in Buffalo with a man named Frank Mullen, another small-time crook known for his quick temper and heavy drinking. Detectives quickly pieced together the broad strokes. Murray and Mullen had been partners in a scam that had gone sour. Witnesses in Buffalo recalled a heated argument between the two over money. Shortly afterward, Murray vanished, and a trunk matching the one found in Cleveland was seen being loaded onto a train by a man fitting Mullen's description. Tracking Mullen wasn't easy. He had a habit of drifting between cities, staying just ahead of the law. But his fondness for the bottle betrayed him. Weeks later, he was arrested in Chicago for public drunkenness. And when his fingerprints were matched to those from the Buffalo scene, the murder charge followed. At trial, Mullen claimed self-defense. He said Murray had attacked him during a drunken quarrel and that he had killed him in the heat of the moment. The trunk, he argued, was a panicked attempt to dispose of the body, not a sign of premeditation. The jury wasn't convinced. The careful binding of the corpse and the long journey of the trunk suggested calculation, not impulse. Mullen was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The man in the trunk case gripped Cleveland not just because of its brutality, but because it spoke to a growing anxiety of the era, the idea that modern transportation could allow crimes to travel invisibly from city to city, crossing jurisdictions faster than the law could keep up. For weeks after, travelers passing through Union Depot glanced uneasily at the baggage room, imagining what other secrets might be locked away in ordinary-looking trunks. Long before Cleveland became infamous for the Kingsbury Run murders, another grisly discovery hinted at what was to come. In 1929, city workers clearing a clogged sewer drain found something that didn't belong there, and it would haunt the city for years. It was the morning of August 9, 1929, and a maintenance crew was working near West 9th Street, clearing a section of sewer that had been backing up for days. The job was routine, the kind of work done quietly and without much notice. But when one of the men reached into the muck with a hooked pole, the object he pulled up froze everyone in place. It was a human torso. The body had been severed cleanly at the neck and waist, stripped of clothing, and dumped into the sewer system. The skin was pale and waterlogged, suggesting it had been submerged for some time. There were no identifying marks, no tattoos, no scars, nothing to hint at who the victim was. Police were called immediately, and a search of nearby drains and outlets began. Over the next 2 days, more remains surfaced. Parts of the arms, a section of one thigh. But the head and much of the lower body were never found. Without them, identification was nearly impossible. The coroner estimated the victim to be a man in his 30s, healthy and well-nourished before death. The cuts were precise, too precise to be the work of an amateur. Investigators speculated that the killer had medical or butchering skills, a detail that would take on chilling significance a few years later when Cleveland was terrorized by the torso murderer in Kingsbury Run. At the time, however, there was no serial killer narrative, only an unsolved murder. Detectives canvassed hospitals, morgues, and missing persons lists from Cleveland to neighboring counties, but no match emerged. Rumors swirled. Some whispered it was a gangland killing, the victim punished for crossing the wrong people. Others suspected a domestic dispute turned deadly, with the body dismembered to prevent recognition. Still others feared it was the work of a sadist who would strike again. In the end, the trail went cold. The torso was buried in a pauper's grave, the name of its owner never discovered. Looking back, many historians now see the 1929 torso in the sewer case as a grim foreshadowing of the torso murders that would begin in 1934, killings marked by similar dismemberment and the same frustrating lack of identification. For Cleveland, it was a disturbing reminder that sometimes the city's darkest stories start not with headlines, but with a quiet worker in a sewer tunnel, pulling the unthinkable out of the shadows. Cleveland wasn't the Wild West, but on a cold night in 1908, you wouldn't have known it from the sound of gunfire echoing down St. Clair Avenue. By the time the smoke cleared, one man was dead, another was bleeding in the street, and the city had a new legend of lawlessness. The trouble started at O'Malley's Saloon, a working man's bar near East 55th Street, where dock laborers, railroad hands, and drifters came to drink after long shifts. On the evening of January 27, 1908, the place was packed, the air heavy with cigar smoke and the smell of beer. Among the crowd were Frank "Red" Porter, a small-time safecracker with a habit of flashing his money, and Joseph Malloy, a wiry ex-con with a quick temper. The two men had a history, an old dispute over a botched burglary years earlier, and that night, the tension between them boiled over. Witnesses later said it began with insults shouted across the bar, then a shove, then a punch. Porter was shoved into a table, knocking over drinks. He got up, red-faced, and stormed out into the freezing street. Malloy followed. Out on St. Clair, the fight escalated fast. Porter pulled a revolver from his coat and fired. The shot missed, but Malloy answered with his own pistol, the flash lighting up the dark street. Passers-by scattered, diving for cover behind barrels and doorways. For nearly a minute, the two men traded shots in the middle of the road, their boots slipping on ice as each tried to get the drop on the other. One bullet shattered the window of a tailor shop, another lodged in the side of a passing streetcar. Finally, Porter took a round to the chest and collapsed onto the slush-covered pavement. Malloy, bleeding from a graze to his arm, staggered toward him, and that's when police arrived. Officers had been just blocks away when they heard the first shots. They disarmed Malloy on the spot and hauled him to the station, where he claimed self-defense. "He was gonna kill me," Malloy insisted. "I just shot first." The coroner's report made it clear Porter's wound had been fatal before help could arrive. Malloy went to trial within weeks, but the jury, perhaps swayed by the idea of two criminals settling their own feud, convicted him only of manslaughter. The papers had a field day. Gunfight on St. Clair blared from headlines, and for months afterward, the saloon where it began drew curious drinkers who wanted to see the spot where two armed men had turned a Cleveland street into a shooting gallery. It was a reminder that, even in a growing industrial city far from cattle towns and frontier law, human grudges could still play out with all the recklessness of a Wild West duel. On a warm August afternoon in 1944, the steady hum of life on East 105th Street was shattered by the crack of gunfire. Within minutes, the sidewalks were strewn with bodies, shop windows were blown out, and Cleveland had witnessed one of the deadliest rampages in its history. The summer of 1944 was a tense one in Cleveland. The city's factories were working around the clock for the war effort. Neighborhoods were crowded with new workers, and tempers ran short. But nothing could have prepared anyone for what happened on August 24th. Just before 3 p.m., Willie the Barber Johnson, a 44-year-old African-American man known in the Glenville neighborhood for cutting hair and keeping mostly to himself, walked out of his small shop with a rifle slung casually in his hands. Witnesses said he looked calm, almost detached, as he stepped into the bustle of East 105th Street. Without warning, Johnson raised the gun and began firing. His first shots struck a group of men gathered outside a corner store, killing one instantly. Pedestrians screamed and scattered. Streetcars ground to a halt. Shopkeepers slammed doors shut and ducked behind counters. Johnson moved methodically down the sidewalk, reloading as he went. He fired into storefronts, at people trying to flee, at anyone who caught his eye. Some witnesses said he muttered to himself between shots. Others thought he was smiling. Within minutes, the first police officers arrived. They exchanged gunfire with Johnson, but he ducked into an alley, reappearing suddenly to shoot at a patrol car, wounding an officer. The chaos spread for several blocks as more units rushed in, unsure exactly where the shooter was at any given moment. Finally, cornered in a vacant lot, Johnson made his last stand. A burst of return fire from police brought him down, ending the rampage less than 15 minutes after it began. The toll was staggering. 6 dead, more than a dozen wounded. The victims included a store clerk, a delivery driver, a teenage boy on his way home from the library, and an elderly man who had been sitting on a stoop in the sun. Investigators were baffled by motive. Johnson had no known political ties, no criminal record beyond a few minor disputes, and no recent personal losses. Friends described him as quiet, almost withdrawn, though some mentioned he'd been complaining lately about feeling watched and talked about by neighbors. Theories of mental illness emerged, but wartime pressures and racial tensions in Cleveland added a deeper layer of unease to the public conversation. In the days that followed, East 105th Street slowly returned to life, but the memory of that afternoon lingered. For years afterward, Older residents would lower their voices when talking about the day of the gunman, as if speaking too loudly might invite the horror back. It was a final, chilling reminder, in a city already scarred by decades of crime and tragedy, that violence could erupt anywhere, at any time, leaving only questions in its wake.